The string quartet was playing Pachelbel when I saw her walk in wearing my color, not a similar shade. My color. The deep emerald green I'd worn to every Whitfield Foundation gala for 11 years running, the one my husband Richard always said made me look like I belonged on the cover of a magazine. She wore it better than me, if I'm being honest, because she was 29 and 6 months pregnant, and the dress had clearly been altered by someone who knew exactly how to drape silk over a growing belly without making it look like an accommodation. I was standing by the silent auction table at the Drake Hotel in Chicago, holding a glass of champagne I hadn't touched, when my friend Donna grabbed my elbow hard enough to leave a mark. "Sarah," she said. "Sarah, look at the door." Richard walked in first. Then she came in behind him, her hand resting on the small of his back like she'd done it 1,000 times before, and the room, 320 guests, half of them board members of companies Richard had built or bought or buried over 30 years. Went quiet in that particular way a room goes quiet, when everyone already knows something you don't. Before I tell you what happened next, I'm Sarah, and you're watching Beyond Truth Revealed. Now, here's what happened. I'd planned this gala for 8 months. I'd personally approved the seating chart, the floral budget, the order of the silent auction items, the exact moment the lights would dim for the video tribute to last year's donors. I knew, the way you know your own kitchen in the dark, that there was no seat for a pregnant woman in green at table 4, which was Richard's table, which was 6 feet from the podium where I was supposed to give the closing remarks in 40 minutes. My name is Sarah Calloway. I'm 54 years old. I've been an estate attorney in Chicago for 26 years, and the thing about estate law is that you spend your whole career reading the fine print other people never bothered to read. The clause buried on page 9, the beneficiary nobody mentioned out loud at Thanksgiving, the small print that turns out to be the whole point. You'd think that would make a person suspicious of her own life. It didn't. Not until that night. Richard saw me before she did. I watched his face do the thing faces do when a math problem suddenly has too many variables. That half-second of recalculation, the eyes flicking once toward the exits before settling back into composure. Then he smiled at me the way he'd smiled at me for 31 years, easy and warm, like nothing in the world was wrong, and he walked toward me with his hand already extended for mine, the way he always greeted donors he needed something from. "Sarah, you remember Priya," he said. From the Singapore office. I did not remember Priya. I had never met Priya. And Priya, whoever she was, did not look like someone visiting from an office on a business trip. She looked like someone who had been somewhere private enough, recently enough, that her body had changed shape because of it, and she was wearing flats instead of heels, which told me she'd been advised by somebody, a stylist, a friend, maybe Richard himself, on exactly how to stand at a function like this without drawing the kind of attention that gets photographed. "Of course," I said, and I shook her hand, because what else does a person do at her own gala in front of 320 witnesses when the floor has quietly become a different floor than the one she walked in on 40 minutes earlier? Donna pulled me aside near the bar, her fingers still tight on my arm. "Sarah. Sarah, do you know her?" "No." "Do you know what she does for Whitfield Holdings?" "No. Sarah, she's not from Singapore. My nephew works in that office. There's no Priya in that office." I asked him 3 weeks ago when Richard first mentioned bringing someone from overseas to the gala because something about the way he said it felt rehearsed. 3 weeks ago. He had been planning this for 3 weeks, at minimum, and Donna had known enough to ask questions before I'd even known there was a question to ask. I want to tell you I made a scene. I didn't. I gave my closing remarks at 8:40 p.m. exactly as scheduled, thanked the donors by name the way I always do, announced that we'd raised $410,000 for the children's wing at Lurie Children's Hospital, and smiled the smile I'd been trained since childhood to produce on command, The one my mother used to call my company face. Richard clapped from table 4. Priya clapped beside him, her hand never leaving that spot on her belly, like she was keeping something warm, like the gesture itself was a kind of quiet announcement she didn't need words for. I didn't confront him that night. I want to be honest about that, because honesty is the only thing I have left of that version of myself. I went home to our house in Lake Forest. I took off the emerald dress and hung it carefully on the cedar hanger, because some habits don't break even when your marriage is breaking. And I sat at the kitchen island until 4 in the morning with my laptop open to a blank search bar, the cursor blinking in a way that felt almost patient, like it already knew what I was about to find and was simply waiting for me to be ready. I typed her name, Priya Anand. 17 results, none of them Singapore, none of them Whitfield Holdings. One of them was a property record buried on page 2, the kind of public filing most people never think to check because they assume their own life is exactly what it looks like from the outside. A condo on East Lake Shore Drive, 11 floors up, purchased 11 months ago for $1.1 million. The deed had 2 names on it. Richard's middle name is Holloway. Most people don't know that. Not his colleagues, not his board, not even most of our friends. The deed listed the buyer as R. Holloway Whitfield. I'm an estate attorney. I know exactly what it means when a man starts using a name nobody uses for him. It means he's building a second life and he didn't want the first one to find the paperwork. It means somewhere, in some quiet administrative moment, he sat across from a title company representative and signed a name that wasn't quite a lie, just a door he thought I'd never think to open. I closed the laptop at 4:12 a.m., Richard's flight from the Gala after party. There was an after party, apparently. One I hadn't been invited to in my own house, in my own marriage. Wasn't due to land him home until morning. I had hours. I had a law degree. And I had a filing cabinet in my own downtown office that contained something Richard had asked me to draft for him 11 years ago, back when we still told each other things, back when he still trusted me with the one piece of paper that mattered more than any vow we'd said out loud. I just didn't yet know how much that paper was about to be worth. I didn't sleep. At 6 in the morning, I drove to my office on LaSalle Street before the sun was fully up, let myself in with the night code, and went straight to the locked cabinet behind my desk, where I keep documents too sensitive for the shared filing system. The kind of paper that outlives the people who signed it. The folder was labeled WHWIT filed, personal, in my own handwriting, dated 11 years back. Richard had come to me not as my husband but as a client, the way he sometimes did when something mattered enough that he wanted attorney-client privilege between us instead of pillow talk. He'd wanted a post-nuptial agreement drafted. Not because we were in trouble, we weren't, but because Whitfield Holdings was about to go through a recapitalization and his lawyers had advised him to formally separate his personal assets from any future business restructuring. For clean accounting, he'd said, sitting across from my desk in a suit instead of pajamas, calling me counselor instead of Sarah for the better part of an hour. At the time, I'd thought it was about protecting the company from a hypothetical divorce neither of us expected. 2 people 14 years into a marriage that still felt, most days, like the safest room I'd ever stood in. I drafted it the way I draft everything, conservatively, in his favor on paper, but with one clause I'd insisted on adding because 11 years ago I was already, on some animal level, protecting myself in a way I couldn't have explained out loud. The clause stated that any equity acquired or restructured under undisclosed shell entities or any attempt to dilute marital assets through third-party holding structures would void the postnups protective terms entirely and revert asset classification to standard Illinois marital property law. Richard had laughed when I added it. You think I'm going to hide money from you, counselor? I think people change, I'd said. I'd rather have a clause we never use than need one we don't have. He'd signed it without reading that page twice. I remember that specifically, the way his pen moved fast over a clause he didn't think would ever matter, the small, impatient flourish of it, like a man signing a parking ticket he intended to forget by lunch. Now I sat in my office at 6:40 a.m. with that document open beside my laptop, and I pulled up the Cook County property records again. The East Lake Shore Drive condo wasn't the only thing R. Holloway Whitfield had purchased. There was a holding company, registered in Delaware 14 months ago, called Anand Meridian LLC. I am an estate attorney, not a forensic accountant, but I know how to read a public filing, and Anand Meridian LLC's registered agent shared an address with a law firm Richard's company used for exactly one purpose over the years: structuring overseas acquisitions before they were announced to the board. Whitfield Holdings was in the middle of finalizing the sale of its logistics division to a Japanese conglomerate. I knew this because I'd heard Richard on the phone about it for 6 months. Low, urgent calls taken in the garage, in the car, once in the bathroom at his sister's birthday dinner. I didn't know the actual number until that morning, when I remembered the unredacted term sheet I'd seen sitting in his home office desk drawer 2 days before the gala. I'd gone looking for stamps, not secrets, the Tuesday before, and I'd glanced at the cover page and thought nothing of it, because I trusted him the way you trust a floor you've walked on for 31 years without once checking for rot. $1.2 billion. That was the sale price, and Anand Meridian LLC, formed 14 months ago, held a 12% minority stake that had been quietly transferred out of Whitfield's primary equity structure into something Richard's own board hadn't been told about, structured exactly the way a person structures something they intend to walk away with, under a name that wasn't his, beside a woman whose pregnancy made the timeline very specific, very deliberate, very hard to explain away as coincidence. 14 months ago, Priya was visibly 6 months pregnant at the gala. I did the math 3 times on a legal pad, the way I make junior associates double-check their own arithmetic before bringing it to me, because I needed to be wrong, and I wasn't. My phone buzzed on the desk. Richard. Home now. Where are you? I typed back. At the office. Catching up on something. That was true, in a way he wouldn't understand for several more days. I called my old law school roommate, Marguerite Okafor, who'd left private practice 15 years ago to become one of the most feared forensic litigators in Illinois corporate law, the kind of attorney opposing counsels mentioned by name the way you'd mention a storm warning. We hadn't spoken in 2 years, not since her own divorce, the one I'd quietly helped her survive without ever billing her a single hour, because some debts aren't meant to be collected. They're meant to be remembered. Sarah Calloway, she said, her voice still thick with sleep. It's 7 in the morning. I need you to look at something. Off the books. Today. Is this about Richard? I hadn't said his name. I felt the questions land somewhere just beneath my ribs. Why would you ask that? There was a pause on the line, the kind of pause that costs a friendship if you let it sit too long without filling it, the kind of silence where you can almost hear someone deciding how much of the truth they're willing to be responsible for. Sarah, Marguerite said carefully, each word placed like she was setting down something breakable. I need you to tell me what you already know, because I think I might know something too. I sat very still in my office chair, the postnup agreement open on my desk under the gray morning light coming through the LaSalle Street window, 11 floors of downtown Chicago, waking up around me with no idea that anything in my life had shifted. And I asked her the only question that actually mattered. How long have you known about her? The silence that followed was 4 seconds long. I counted it, the way I count everything now, the way a person counts things when she's trying to hold on to some sense of control over a morning that has already stopped belonging to her. 8 months, Marguerite finally said. I'm sorry. I didn't know how to tell you, and I kept hoping it would resolve itself before I had to. And Sarah, there's more. It's not just the condo and the LLC. There's something about the Foundation Gala account you need to see before anyone else does. I should have called you weeks ago. I think I was a coward about it, and I'm sorry, and I don't have time to be sorry about it right now, because there's a clock running that you don't know about yet. What clock? Come to my office, she said. Today. Now. If you can. Some things shouldn't be said over a phone, and this is one of them. Sarah, whatever you think you found this morning, it's smaller than what's actually happening. I need you to brace yourself before you walk in here. I drove to Marguerite's office on North Michigan Avenue instead of asking her to send anything electronically. Some conversations shouldn't exist in writing until you decide they should, and after 11 years of drafting documents for a living, I've learned that the safest information is the kind that hasn't been typed yet. 1. Her office had the particular quiet of a place where bad news gets delivered for a living. Soft carpet that swallowed footsteps, no windows facing the street. A box of tissues angled on the corner of the desk like a permanent fixture nobody ever needed to ask about. Marguerite didn't do small talk, not even after 2 years apart. She slid a folder across to me before I'd even taken off my coat. The Whitfield Foundation Gala account, she said. The one you've personally run for 11 years. 410,000 raised last night. You announced from the podium? That's what I announced. That's what the receipts showed when I closed out the silent auctions at 11 o'clock. The actual deposit that hit the foundation's bank this morning was $260,000. I felt something cold settle into my chest. Not panic exactly, something quieter and worse. The particular stillness that comes right before your hands start shaking. That's not possible. I reconcile that account myself every single year. I've never once let anyone else touch it. You reconcile the account you have access to, Marguerite said. There's a second account. Same legal name, different routing number, opened 9 months ago. Whoever set it up used the foundation's EIN and a template of your signature, Sarah, pulled from old grant paperwork, most likely, the kind that sits in a shared drive for years because nobody thinks to lock it. It's not hard to do if you have access to the files, which, she paused, choosing the next words carefully, the way you choose words for someone standing near a ledge. Priya Anand did. As a contractor. For 4 months, doing what the invoices called donor relations consulting. She worked for my foundation. She worked for your foundation, in your building with access to your filing system. 4 months before that gala. I think that's how she met Richard, or how Richard arranged for her to be there in the first place. I can't prove intent yet, Sarah. I can prove the money. I am not a woman who cries in other people's offices. I'd built a 26-year career partly on that fact, on the steady hands, and the level voice that made nervous clients trust me with their worst family secrets. But I sat in Marguerite's chair and felt my hands go cold the way they do right before a migraine, and I asked the question I'd been avoiding since 4 a.m., the one that had nothing to do with Richard at all. Is the foundation in legal trouble? Did I just stand at a podium in front of 320 people and announce a number that was a lie? You announced the number you were given. If someone fed you false reconciliation figures, that's not foundation fraud on your part, but it is fraud, full stop, and the IRS doesn't care whose marriage it happened inside of. Marguerite leaned forward, her elbows on the desk. Sarah, I need to ask you something, and I need you to actually think before you answer, not just react. Has Richard asked you, at any point in the last year, to sign anything you didn't read carefully? Anything related to the foundation, the house, joint accounts, anything at all? I thought of the gala seating chart, the catering invoices I'd approved without reading past the totals, and then I thought of the check, three weeks ago at breakfast, Richard sliding it across the table between the coffee pot and $18,000 made out for Foundation Database Migration Services. Because he'd said the donor system needed updating before the gala, and I'd trusted the man I'd been married to for 31 years enough not to ask, migrated by whom, or to where. "There's a check," I said slowly. $18,000. I signed it without really looking. I think I need to find out who cashed it. Marguerite was already writing it down, her pen moving fast across a legal pad of her own. "I'll have my forensic accountant pull the routing information today. Sarah, there's one more thing, and this is the part with the clock attached. The Japanese acquisition, the logistics division sale. I know about the 12%. Anand Meridian LLC Sabu, you know about the equity. Do you know the closing date?" I didn't. I realized, sitting there, that I had spent 6 months overhearing the broad strokes of the biggest transaction of my husband's career, and had never once asked the one question that would have mattered. 11 days from now, Marguerite said. Once that sale closes, the equity transfer becomes irreversible under Delaware law. Right now, today, it's still sitting in a structure that can be legally challenged. In 11 days, it's gone, clean, finalized, untouchable. Richard's own board doesn't know Anand Meridian exists. The Japanese buyers definitely don't know they're closing a billion-dollar deal that includes assets quietly siphoned out from under the company's own valuation. And you, Sarah, your post-nup clause only protects you if you act before that closing date, because once the sale finalizes, the assets stop being marital property that's being hidden. They become a completed corporate transaction. Different law, different remedy. A much, much harder fight, if it's even still a fight you can win. 11 days. I thought about the dress hanging in my closet, the one I'd hung up carefully at 4 in the morning because some habits don't break even when the life around them is already over. Marguerite, I need you to tell me exactly what I have to do, in order, starting today. No version of this where I wait and see how I feel about it tomorrow. She finally allowed herself something close to a smile, the kind of smile people wear when they've been waiting a long time for someone to finally ask them the right question. First, she said, we need a forensic accountant who specializes in tracing shell entity equity transfers, and I already know exactly the one to call. Second, you go home tonight and act like you know nothing, because the moment Richard suspects you're onto the timeline, he'll move the closing date up, and we lose our entire window. Third, and I need you to actually hear this, Sarah, not just nod at it, you need to decide right now whether you want a divorce settlement or whether you want what that clause you wrote 11 years ago actually entitles you to. Because those are not the same number. They're not even the same kind of number. What's the difference? A divorce settlement is negotiated, Sarah. What your clause entitles you to, if we can prove concealment before that closing date, isn't a settlement at all. She tapped the folder once, like punctuation. It's a forfeiture. The entire 12% reverts to marital property, split under Illinois law, and in a marriage this long, with assets this thoroughly commingled, that doesn't mean you get a percentage of his half. It means the entire $1.2 billion transaction becomes the valuation basis for the marital estate itself the moment that clause legally triggers. I drove home that evening, with my hands steady on the wheel and my face arranged into something that would pass for normal, and when Richard kissed my cheek in the kitchen and asked how my day was, I told him it was fine, busy, nothing interesting. He had no idea that somewhere in a forensic accountant's office on North Michigan Avenue, the clock on his secret had just started running backward, and that I was the one who'd started it. The forensic accountant's name was Diane Reyes, and she worked out of a converted loft in the West Loop that looked nothing like an accounting office and everything like a war room. 3 monitors mounted on one wall, a whiteboard covered in arrows nobody had bothered to erase from a previous case, the smell of old coffee that had clearly been reheated more than once. Marguerite brought me there 2 days later, on a Thursday, while Richard was in New York for what he'd told me was a board retreat. I'd checked his calendar app before I left the house that morning. The one we'd shared for 9 years. For exactly this kind of logistical convenience, the kind of small domestic trust you don't think about until it becomes evidence. It still said New York. I no longer believed it said the truth. Deanne had spread 3 laptops across a long table, each one open to a different thread of the same rope. She didn't shake my hand when I walked in. She just looked at me for a second, the way doctors look at you right before they tell you something, and said, "I want to show you something before we get into the technical parts, because I think you need to see her, not just the paperwork." She turned one screen toward me. A LinkedIn profile, since deleted, archived by some tool I didn't ask the name of. Priya Anand, age 29, previously senior donor relations consultant, independent contractor, Chicago. Before that, associate, Whitfield Holdings Singapore office. 18 months, ending 3 years ago. She really did work for Singapore, I said, surprised at how disappointed I felt to learn that one small piece of it hadn't been invented. She really did, which means the lie at the gala wasn't the job itself. It was the timing. Whitfield Holdings Singapore eliminated her position in a restructuring 3 years ago. Standard layoff, on paper. But according to the severance records I pulled, the package wasn't negotiated through HR. It went through executive override. Guess who has personal override authority for international severance packages above a certain dollar threshold? I didn't have to guess. I sat down in the nearest chair without being offered one. Sarah, I don't say this to hurt you further. I say it because the pattern matters for what comes next. Diane's voice was steady, clinical, the voice of someone who delivered this exact kind of sentence to other women before me and had learned, the hard way, exactly how to pace it. This wasn't a man having an affair that got complicated. The condo, the LLC, the contractor role at your own foundation, the severance override 3 years ago. This is a structure that took years to build carefully, in layers. Whoever built it was patient. That usually means one of 2 things. Either Richard is far more calculated than the man you've described to Marguerite over the years, or someone else built the structure first and brought him into it once it was already standing. What do you mean, brought him into it? Diane pulled up a different document, a wire transfer log for Anand Meridian LLC, dense with routing numbers and dates. The LLC has 3 authorized signers. Richard, under the Holloway name. Priya, and a third name I want you to look at very carefully because Marguerite tells me you've actually met him. More than once. The name on the screen was Gerald Mott. I knew Gerald Mott. Everyone in Chicago philanthropic circles knew Gerald Mott. He'd sat on the Whitfield Foundation's advisory board for 6 years, a soft-spoken man in his 60s with reading glasses he wore on a chain and a habit of remembering everyone's children's names who'd spent the last 2 years gently offering to help modernize our donor systems, which was the exact phrase Richard had used at breakfast about the $18,000 check. Gerald Mott runs the second foundation account, Diane said. The one that received $260,000 last night instead of the $410 you raised and announced. He's not just a board advisor who shows up to galas, Sarah. He's the registered agent listed on Anand Meridian LLC's Delaware filing, same address as the law firm structuring the entire Japanese sale. Marguerite leaned forward, her hands flat on the table like she was bracing it, or herself. Gerald didn't get close to your foundation by accident, Sarah. 6 years on your board. Access, trust, your signature on file from 100 grant approvals, and a direct line to the exact law firm handling the largest transaction of Richard's career. I think Gerald Mott built this. I think Richard walked into something that was already half constructed, and Priya was already part of the architecture long before she ever stood next to him at that gala in your dress. I thought of Gerald at last year's gala, refilling my champagne glass himself before I'd even noticed it was empty, telling me how lucky the foundation was to have someone like me running things with such precision. I thought of how many times, over coffee after board meetings, He'd asked, gently, almost paternally, whether I ever got tired of handling everything myself, whether I'd ever consider letting the board take some of that administrative weight off your shoulders. Sarah, you do so much. He was offering to take the books away from me, I said slowly, the realization landing like something physical. For years, quietly. And I kept saying no, because I liked running it myself, and because you kept saying no, Diane said. He had to build a second account from scratch instead of just quietly editing your real one. That's actually useful for us, in a strange way. It means the fraud has fingerprints. Sloppy ones, because he had to build it around your refusal instead of through your cooperation. People who plan for 10 years don't expect to be told no by the one person actually watching the ledger. I drove home that night through a Chicago dusk, the color of a bruise just starting to heal, and for the first time since the Gala, I didn't feel like a woman who'd been betrayed. I felt like a woman holding a structural map of exactly how she'd been betrayed, room by room, joint by joint, which is a very different feeling and a far more useful one, because a map can be read, and a betrayal you can read is a betrayal you can eventually answer. Richard called from New York at 9 that night. I asked him how the board retreat was going. He said productive, said he missed me, said he'd be home Sunday evening. I said I missed him too, and the strange thing, the thing I want you to understand, is that in that exact moment, some small, stubborn, 31-year-old part of me actually did, even while the rest of me was sitting at a kitchen island, calculating exactly how much that man owed me. The threat hadn't fully arrived yet. Gerald Mott didn't know that I knew his name, but I could feel its shape now, standing just outside the door of my own life, waiting, the way you wait outside a room when you already know what's inside it, and you're only deciding when to knock. The knock came on Saturday, 2 days before Richard was due home, and it wasn't Richard at all. It was Gerald Mott, standing on my front porch in Lake Forest with a bottle of wine and the kind of smile men wear when they think they're still several moves ahead of you. Sarah, I heard you've been spending some time downtown with old friends. He said it lightly, like weather, like he was commenting on traffic. Marguerite Okafor, I understand. How is she? I always liked her. I let him in because refusing would have told him more than letting him stay. We sat in the living room, the one with the good light in the afternoons, and he poured wine, I didn't drink, and he talked for 10 minutes about the Foundation's exciting growth phase, about a donor pipeline he wanted to formalize, about systems and modernization and language so smooth, it almost slid past me entirely before he finally said what he'd actually driven 40 minutes to say. I think it might be time to formalize my role with the Foundation accounts, Sarah. Officially. A board resolution, proper signing authority, the whole structure modernized and protected. He smiled, the reading glasses pushed up into his gray hair. Marriages go through things. I'd hate for the Foundation's books to be exposed to any personal turbulence while you're dealing with whatever you're dealing with. There it was. Not a threat, not technically. A velvet-wrapped warning. Step back from the books, stop asking questions, or I will personally make sure the chaos of your marriage becomes the official story of why the Foundation needed new management, and you needed to be quietly, kindly set aside from it. Gerald, I said, keeping my voice exactly as level as I would in a deposition, did Richard ask you to come here? Richard doesn't know I'm here. He set down his glass with a small, precise click against the coffee table. This is between us. Old friends looking out for an institution we both care about, and the $260,000 that actually landed in the Foundation account versus the $410,000 I announced from the podium 2 weeks ago. Is that something old friends look out for too? His face didn't change much. That was the worst part, how little it changed, how practiced the stillness was, like a man who'd had this exact conversation, or one very close to it, before. I think you're under a great deal of stress, Sarah. Galas are exhausting to run. Numbers get confused. especially under that kind of pressure. I'd hate for you to say something publicly that you'd later need to walk back, in front of donors who've trusted you for 11 years. It wasn't subtle anymore. It was a threat dressed as concern, the most dangerous kind there is, because I understood, sitting there in my own living room, that if I repeated his words to anyone without proof, I would sound exactly like a stressed, humiliated, soon-to-be ex-wife losing her grip on reality, which was, I realized with total clarity, the entire design of the sentence he'd just spoken. Not just to take the equity quietly, to make sure that if I noticed, my noticing would look like instability instead of evidence. He left 20 minutes later, the wine bottle still mostly full on my counter, condensation pooling beneath it like a small apology. Nobody would clean up. I called Marguerite the second his taillights cleared the driveway. He came to my house. What did he say? I told her everything, word for word, the way I'd trained myself to recall testimony for 26 years. She was quiet for a moment on the other end of the line. Sarah, that's not nothing. That's witness intimidation, the soft version, but it's on the record now. Between us, the moment you write it down. More importantly, it tells us he's nervous. People who feel secure don't drive 40 minutes to Lake Forest on a Saturday afternoon to deliver a warning in person. He made a point of saying, Richard doesn't know he came. Do you believe that? I think, Marguerite said slowly, weighing it, that we need to find out exactly how much Richard actually knows versus how much he's been managed without realizing it. Because there's a version of this, Sarah, where your husband is the architect of his own betrayal, fully aware, fully in control, and there's a version where he's a 56-year-old man who got flattered, then cornered, by people considerably smarter than him about exactly this kind of structure. I don't know which version is true yet, but I think you're about to find out, because Diane just sent me something 20 minutes ago that changes the timeline. You need to see it tonight. She sent the document over an hour later. A draft separation agreement, dated 2 months ago. 2 full months before the gala, before I'd known anything at all, drawn up not by any firm Richard had ever used for our family's affairs, but by the same law firm structuring a non-meridian and the entire Japanese sale. It proposed a settlement to me, the future ex-wife, of $4 million, structured as a single lump sum, in exchange for a full waiver of any further claims against Whitfield Holdings equity, including but not limited to any postnuptial provisions executed prior to current date. $4 million, against a structure built around $1.2 billion. They hadn't drafted this to hand me yet. They'd drafted it to have ready for the exact moment after the Japanese sale closed, when my clause would no longer legally apply, when $4 million would look generous instead of insulting, when I would have no idea there had ever been a bigger number sitting on the table at all. Richard's signature wasn't on it, not yet. But his name was in every line of it, and Priya's name was listed as a joint beneficiary of related holding structures. In a clause buried on page 11, the kind of clause nobody reads twice, the kind I used to warn clients about for a living. I sat at my kitchen island at midnight, the same spot where all of this had started 11 nights earlier, and I understood with total, almost peaceful clarity that I was not looking at a marriage quietly falling apart. I was looking at a liquidation plan with my name listed as the asset being managed out of it, and I had 8 days left before it became permanent. And the man flying home from New York on Sunday evening still believed, completely, that I knew nothing at all. I picked Richard up from O'Hare myself on Sunday evening. He seemed surprised, pleased, even, that I'd come instead of sending the car service like I usually did when he flew back from these trips. You didn't have to do this, he said, sliding into the passenger seat, kissing my cheek like it was any other Sunday. I wanted to, I said, and pulled out into traffic, and for the next 40 minutes I asked him about the board retreat, listened to him, describe meetings I now knew, didn't include the one conversation that actually mattered, and watched him lie to me with the same comfortable ease he'd used for 31 years to tell me dinner reservations were at 7 instead of 7:30. Small lies and large ones apparently used the exact same muscle, the same unhurried voice, the same hand resting easily on my knee at a red light. That night, after he fell asleep, I did something I'm not proud of and don't regret. I went through his study, not searching randomly. Diane had given me a list earlier that day, specific documents, specific drawers, the kind of targeted search a person does when she finally knows exactly what she's looking for, instead of stumbling onto it by accident at 4 in the morning with nothing but a search bar and a bad feeling. In the bottom drawer of his desk, beneath a decade of old tax returns nobody ever looks at twice, I found a leather folio I'd never seen before in 31 years of sharing a house with this man. Inside it, a single sheet, handwritten, not typed. Richard's handwriting, the looping R he'd had since I met him at 23, the same R that used to sign birthday cards and mortgage documents, and, 11 years ago, a postnup he hadn't bothered to read twice. It was a letter, unsent, undated, addressed to no one by name. I'm going to tell you part of what it said, because it matters for what happens later, but I won't tell you all of it, because some of it was never meant for anyone, including me, and I think even now he deserves to keep that much. He'd written about feeling erased inside his own company, about a board that increasingly deferred to younger executives half his age, about Gerald Mott approaching him 18 months ago with what he'd called an opportunity to secure something just for yourself, off the books, before the old guard pushes you out entirely. He'd written, in his own hand, that he knew it was wrong the moment Gerald first proposed it. He'd written that he told himself it was temporary, a safety net, and nothing more, not a real betrayal, 'cause Sarah would never actually be hurt by it. The marital assets were so large already that 12% would barely register, barely be missed, barely count. He had talked himself into believing the math made it not a betrayal. That was the part that stayed with me longest. Longer than the affair, longer than the child on the way. The fact that he had genuinely, carefully convinced himself that stealing from our marriage in a number too large for me to notice somehow made the theft smaller, instead of so much worse. I photographed every page with my phone, my hands steadier than I expected them to be, returned the folio exactly as I'd found it beneath the tax returns, and went back to bed beside a man who had no idea his own handwriting was about to become evidence in a courtroom. Monday morning, I called an emergency meeting. Not with Richard, not yet, but with Marguerite and Diane and a third person Marguerite had brought in without telling me in advance. Thomas Whitfield Rise, no relation to either family despite the name, a securities attorney who specialized in exactly one thing: forcing emergency disclosure when a corporate transaction involves concealed assets, the kind of lawyer companies hired lawyers specifically to avoid having to face. Here's where we stand, Thomas said, laying it all out across Diane's long table like a hand of cards he already knew was winning. You have 6 days until closing. You have a postnup clause that triggers on proof of undisclosed shell entity asset transfer. You have wire records, a handwritten confession in your husband's own hand, a paper trail connecting a foundation board member directly to the same law firm structuring the sale, and a draft settlement agreement that proves premeditation going back at least 2 months. Sarah, this isn't a divorce case anymore. This is enough to file an emergency injunction tomorrow morning, freezing the Anand Meridian equity before the Japanese sale can close around it, and put it permanently out of reach. What happens to Richard? Legally, civilly, he's exposed to losing far more than 12%, because the clause you wrote 11 years ago doesn't just void the postnup's protective terms, it reclassifies the entire underlying transaction as a disputed marital asset. The Japanese buyers will not want to close a billion-dollar acquisition with active litigation attached to the seller's own equity structure. They'll almost certainly pause the deal entirely until it's resolved, which gives you enormous leverage, because Richard's entire board will find out exactly what he did the moment that injunction becomes public record. And Gerald Mott? Wire fraud, foundation fund diversion, likely securities violations tied to the undisclosed equity structure he engineered. That's not civil anymore, Sarah. That's the U.S. Attorney's Office, and once they start pulling threads, they don't stop at the first one. I sat with that for a long moment, the West Loop morning light coming flat and gray through Diane's windows. 6 days ago, I had been a woman finding out her husband had a pregnant mistress at a gala she'd spent 8 months planning. Now I was looking at the paperwork. To dismantle a billion-dollar conspiracy, file the groundwork for federal charges against a man who'd poured my wine at his own dinner table for 6 years, and walk into a courtroom holding evidence in my husband's own handwriting that he had decided, quietly, privately, that I was too comfortable, too well provided for, to ever be worth telling the truth. File it, I said. Tomorrow morning. Before he wakes up and realizes I already know everything. The injunction was filed at 8:14 a.m. on Tuesday in Cook County Circuit Court, under emergency motion procedures Thomas had used 4 times before in his career and never once lost. By 11 a.m., Richard's general counsel had called him out of a strategy meeting on the 32nd floor. By 1 p.m., he was standing in our kitchen in Lake Forest, holding his phone like it had just bitten him, staring at me across the island where 11 days earlier I'd sat alone in the dark discovering the first thread of all of this. Sarah, what did you do? It wasn't a question. It came out flat, almost breathless, the voice of a man watching a building he'd spent 18 months constructing come down in real time. I protected myself, I said, the way you taught me to, professionally, for 26 years. I just finally applied it to my own life. This will destroy the sale, the board, the Japanese partners, everything we've worked. We didn't work for anything, Richard. You worked for Anand Meridian LLC. I worked for the foundation Gala you let Gerald Mott quietly defraud, while Priya sat in my building, on my payroll, learning my signature. His face went through several things at once. Anger first, sharp and immediate, then something closer to fear, as the math of his own exposure caught up with him in real time, and then, unmistakably, something that looked almost like relief. The way a person looks when a secret they've been carrying alone for 18 months finally gets set down on a table where someone else can see its full weight, and they don't have to be the only one holding it anymore. I never meant for you to find out this way, he said. There was no way that wasn't this way, Richard. You built a structure specifically designed to make sure I never found out at all. The this way you're upset about is the only way you left available to me. He sat down at the island, the same seat he'd sat in for 3 decades of breakfasts, of coffee poured before either of us were fully awake, of small ordinary mornings that I now understood I'd have to relearn how to remember. And for the first time in 11 days, he didn't try to manage the conversation, didn't reach for the easy, practiced warmth that had carried him through 31 years of getting exactly what he wanted from rooms full of people. Gerald came to me 18 months ago, he said quietly. I was scared, Sarah. The board was circling. You didn't see it, because I made sure you never had to see it. But I watched 2 executives my own age get pushed sideways into advisory roles that meant absolutely nothing, dressed up to look like promotions. I'm 56. I thought I was protecting something. Protecting us. Eventually, I told myself, even though I knew that wasn't really true. Then Priya, that wasn't supposed to. He stopped himself, his jaw working. I'm not going to make excuses for the rest of it. There aren't any. I looked for some for a long time. There aren't any. Did you know about the foundation account? The $260,000 instead of the $410, I stood up and announced. A long pause, longer than any pause he'd given me, is in 11 days. No. I swear to you, Sarah, no. I didn't know Gerald touched the foundation. That part, I would have stopped that part. I believed him, actually, about that one specific thing, which didn't soften anything else sitting on the table between us. A man can be telling the truth about the smaller crime and still be entirely, completely guilty of the larger one, and I'd learned enough in 26 years of estate law to know that those two facts can live in the same sentence without canceling each other out. The call came at 4 p.m. Thomas, on speaker, with news that moved faster than any of us had expected it to. The Japanese acquisition team, on learning of active litigation over the seller's equity structure, had not paused the deal to wait it out. They had walked entirely. Their statement, released within the hour to every financial outlet in the country, cited material undisclosed liabilities in the seller's corporate structure. 5 words that would follow Whitfield Holdings into every future negotiation for years. The kind of sentence that doesn't go away just because the lawyers eventually settle. By 6 p.m., 3 board members had resigned. By 8 p.m., the Whitfield Holdings board had placed Richard on an indefinite leave of absence pending an internal investigation. An investigation, Thomas confirmed, in a second call that evening, would almost certainly become a federal one within the week, because once the injunctions supporting evidence became part of the public court record, the U.S. Attorney's Office wouldn't need an invitation. They'd already have everything they needed to walk through the door themselves. Gerald Mott was arrested 11 days later at his home in Winnetka on wire fraud charges connected to both the foundation accounts and his role engineering Anand Meridian LLC from the very beginning. Priya Anand was not charged. Investigators found, eventually, that she'd been brought into the structure by Gerald 3 years earlier, told it was a legitimate compensation arrangement tied to her old Singapore severance, and that she'd had no knowledge whatsoever of the foundation fraud layered on top of it later. She gave a statement to investigators that, when Marguerite later showed it to me, read less like a mistress's confession and more like a woman realizing, in real time, on the record, exactly how thoroughly she too had been used by an older man who'd spent his entire career finding people's blind spots and quietly standing inside them. I didn't feel triumphant when I heard that. I felt something closer to recognition. She and I had both trusted men who let other men talk them into believing the math could excuse the morality. Richard moved out of the Lake Forest house on a Thursday in October, 3 weeks after the gala, taking 2 suitcases and leaving the rest for the lawyers to sort through, item by item, room by room. He stood in the driveway for a moment before getting into the car, his hand resting on the open door like he wasn't quite ready to close it. For what it's worth, he said, the 11 years before the last 18 months. Those were real, Sarah. All of it. I need you to know that part wasn't a performance. I know, I said. That's what makes this so much worse. The settlement took 14 months to finalize, not because Richard fought it. By the end, he didn't have the appetite left to fight anything, least of all me, but because untangling a structure built to be untraceable takes far longer than building it did in the first place. Diane's forensic work became, in the end, the backbone of both my civil case and the federal one against Gerald Mott, who pled guilty 8 months in to avoid a trial that would have exposed even more donors, more board members, more quiet arrangements across other foundations he'd spent 2 decades advising. The final number, when it came, was $1.2 billion in underlying transaction value, with my settlement calculated under the triggered postnup clause at a figure that, after taxes, after legal fees, after the long, unglamorous machinery of an actual divorce grinding through actual courtrooms, left me with just under $310 million, not the headline number people imagine when they hear she walked away with $1 billion. The real number. The after everything number, the kind no one puts in a thumbnail because it isn't clean enough, isn't simple enough, doesn't fit in 8 words across the top of a video. I kept the house, in Lake Forest. I did not keep the emerald dress. I gave it to Donna, who has more sense than I do about which objects deserve to survive a story and which ones don't, and she never once asked me why I couldn't do it myself. The Whitfield Foundation survived, technically, under new board leadership and a full forensic audit that Marguerite oversaw personally, free of charge, because she said some things you do for friendship and not for billing hours, and I didn't argue with her about it. I stepped down as chair. Not in disgrace. The investigation cleared me completely, found I'd been a victim of the fraud rather than any part of it. But because I'd spent 11 years building something inside a structure, I no longer trusted myself to see clearly anymore, no matter how carefully I checked it, and I wanted, for once in my life, to build something small enough that I could see every wall of it myself. I opened a small practice 18 months later, 2 blocks from my old LaSalle Street office, taking exactly the kind of clients I used to be one of without ever knowing it. Women in their 50s and 60s, mostly, who come in saying some version of the same sentence. I think there's something in our finances I'm not supposed to look at too closely. I never tell them my own story. I don't need to. I just ask the questions. Nobody asked me for 31 years. And I watch their faces do the thing my face must have done that night at the Drake Hotel. The recalculation, Susu. The quiet, private moment when the floor becomes a different floor than the one they walked in on. Priya had her daughter in February. I heard about it the way you hear about most things in Chicago philanthropic circles. Secondhand, through someone who knew someone who still sent holiday cards to people on both sides of things like this. I sent nothing. I felt nothing performative about that decision. I simply had nothing left to send. But I didn't feel triumphant either. Not by then, not about her specifically. Mostly, I thought about a 29-year-old woman who'd lost a job in Singapore through no fault of her own and gotten talked into a structure by a 60-year-old man who'd built his entire career finding exactly the right kind of vulnerable person and standing quietly inside that vulnerability for years. I thought, there is always, somewhere underneath the worst betrayals, an architect who never has to answer for the people he used as scaffolding. Richard called me once, this past spring, from a number I didn't recognize. I almost didn't answer. He'd taken a position consulting for a smaller logistics firm in Indiana, he told me. Nothing close to what he'd built before. A fraction of the salary, a fraction of the room. He wanted me to know he was in therapy now. Actual weekly therapy, not the kind men do for show, trying to understand, in his words, how a person convinces himself math can replace a conscience. I told him I was glad. And I meant it. In the specific, limited way you can mean something for a person you no longer love, but spent 31 years learning the exact shape of, the way you'd recognize an old friend's handwriting on an envelope, years after you'd stopped expecting letters from them. I still have the Gala seating chart from that night. The one I drew up 8 months in advance. The one with no seat for a pregnant woman in green at table 4, because there was never supposed to be one. I found it in a folder while cleaning out my old office files last month, tucked behind grant applications I'd long since forgotten about. I almost threw it away. Instead, I put it in a drawer, the same kind of drawer where Richard once kept a letter he thought no one would ever read, the same kind of ordinary furniture that turns out, eventually, to be where everyone's truth ends up waiting. Some nights, when the house is quiet, the way it's quiet now, I think about the version of me who hung that emerald dress up carefully at 4 a.m, smoothing the fabric out of habit, while everything underneath the habit was already gone. I don't think she was foolish. I think she just hadn't learned yet what I know now, that the floor doesn't fall out from under you all at once. It goes quietly, one drawer at a time, one document, one small unasked question, until one morning you're standing in a kitchen you still own, in a life you finally understand completely, and the only thing left to do is hang up whatever's left, turn off the light over the stove, and start counting what's actually yours.